Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to explain to you guys why weight training, resistance training, doesn't just impact your muscle tissue. It actually involves a lot of other structures in your body, and it's important that they all be trained in order for you to get results. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skill at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. All right, guys, I mean, when we hear silly stuff like train the muscles, not the joints, you really have to understand that's someone being gimmicky who doesn't understand the biological response in the body to training. Because actually, weight training impacts enormous amounts of structures in your body, and yes, you actually do want to train your joints. You do want to train your joints. For example, I mean, most of you guys look at maybe your dad out there. Maybe you're 20, 25, and you see your dad always complaining about his hips or his joints or his knees, all this other stuff, right? He's complaining about his joints, and he's never lifted or trained. Yeah, that's what your joints are going to be like if you don't ever train them. That's untrained middle-aged joints. That's what happens. They get stiffer, they have problems, right? Or you start looking at your grandma who gets hip fractures, breaks bones easy. Yeah, that's what happens when you don't train your bones. That's what happens when you don't train your bones. And people need to understand that resistance training trains all these structures if done correctly. And you know, a lot of times people will say things like, oh, you don't want to do this for the joint or that. You don't want to lock this joint out. You don't want to move this joint through its a full, effective, safe range of motion. Because you don't want to train the joints. You want to keep constant tension on the muscles. But there's no scientific evidence to support that idea, right? There's the scientific evidence supporting that isn't there. In other words, continual tension or constant tension has never been found to produce better muscle growth. And in fact, there are experts who even do bodybuilding and other sports who are experts with advanced degrees in the field who say there isn't even a hypothesis proposed which would explain why constant tension could produce more muscle growth. In other words, it's something that bodybuilders just kind of made up and said, hey, maybe if we keep constant tension on the muscles, they'll grow faster. Than all the drug-using bodybuilders all did that and just started doing that as a trend. That's not something that was come up with by scientists. That's not something that was come up with by exercise physiologists. That's something that bros in the gym and bodybuilders just kind of thought maybe this would work. I should just try to keep tension on the muscle because, I mean, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to grow the muscle. I should just keep tension on it. That was their mindset. It's not actually based on anything that happens in the body. And again, there's no reason scientifically to even think it's true. All your muscles care about is work done, joint angle specificities, the amount of resistance and tension on them, the amount of fatigue you're creating. That's what they care about. That's what they respond to. But the problem you run into there is that when you really think about it, at any given joint angle, right? Any given joint angle, even something as simple as a bicep, right? At every point in the range of motion, there are muscle fibers in that muscle that only can be recruited at different ranges of motion. Whereas there's a lot of muscles through the length of a muscle that can work through the whole thing. They can work at any point in there. There are muscle fibers that only work at the very end. There's only muscle fibers that work here, ones that work here, here, and even at the top, right? There are muscle fibers at both ends of the range of motion that can only be recruited there. Now, do they make up a large amount? No. They make up a little tiny percentage of the amount of muscles there, but in theory, if you wanted to get as many muscle fibers as possible, you would train a muscle through a fuller range of motion. So that you'd make sure that you get the muscles on all of it, all the fibers that hit all of it, right? It only makes sense. If you really think about how a muscle works, that would be ideal. And that's what the research shows actually tends to produce more muscle growth in the long term, right? But then what about training the joints? Actually, training joints under load with weights that they can handle makes your joints stronger. It improves mobility, right? It improves mobility. It improves mobility. Now, people say, well, what do you mean? Well, flexibility versus mobility. Flexibility is the ability to physically move through a range of motion, right? But is that mobility? In other words, Someone who does yoga and is really, really weak, they're extremely weak. They have almost no strength, but they're very, very limber because they do all this tons of stretching and holding and everything else. They're flexible, but are they mobile? Not really, not if they don't have any strength. Mobility is the ability to display strength through all the effective points in the range of motion. In other words, someone who has a high degree of mobility is strong at the extreme ends of their joint angles, right? When they get all the way to the stretched position or the fully extended position on different joints, they can display large amounts of strength there through all those things. In other words, someone who can squat ass to grass with a fairly heavy weight, who can go all the way down, has really good mobility at the bottom. At least things like their hips and knees, particularly their hips, they have great mobility. Now, someone who can get all the way down there with an empty bar has flexibility, right? But mobility would be the ability to actually display strength of some type through that. In other words, they don't get tremendously weaker when they do that. When they get that extra 2 inches, they don't lose 150 pounds off the bar, right? That's mobility. Well, strength training through longer ranges of motion, through full ranges of motion on joints, builds mobility, strength, and it helps stabilize the joints. In other words, people who can display strength at those terminal ends of the range of motion on different movement patterns, they have better stability in those joints because they are strong in those points. They're less likely to injure those joints doing day-to-day activities. And if they generally are using weights that they can handle through those ranges of motion, I'm not talking about someone who maybe benches 275, but they do board lockouts with 450. Right? Now that might beat your joints up. That might beat your wrist and elbow joints up, right? But if they stuck with only, 250 for reps or even 275, their max, that's not going to damage their elbow joints because it's a weight that they are easily strong enough to move through the range of motion, and it's submaximal on those terminal ends like that, right? It's submaximal. So this idea of people not locking out their elbows designed to lock out. What are you talking about? And usually if you're locking it out with loads that don't exceed your 1 rep max for the full range of motion, it's actually a fairly easy weight at the lockout, right? It's usually fairly easy. Because again, when you see people who can bench 275, who can do lockouts with 400 or 450, that should tell you a lot about your strength on the terminal ends. Of course it's easy. And that's not going to beat your joints up. Your elbows aren't going to get hurt from that. But training that full range of motion is going to train you to have healthier joints. It's going to create more stability around those joints, which actually is training muscles. When you really think about it, what are you training there when you're doing that? You're training the support musculature. Gives you more stable joints. Well, what about bones? Bone density is an enormous factor as we get older. And in fact, unfortunately, this is the downside. People who start training later in life don't gain the same bone density that people who start training in their 20s or their teens do, right? You don't, after about 30, you're going to, if you wait till you're 30 to start resistance training, what you're going to do is keep the bone density that you have, which is good because you might keep the bone density you had at 30 all the way up to age 50. And if you can do that, that's fantastic. You're going to have a lot less problems later. Your bones are going to break less easily. But you don't get much better from there. And that's one of the things that I noticed on my DEXA scan, for example. It noticed that my bone density was the 4th standard deviation above average. It was almost off the chart. Well, I started power training and powerlifting in my early and mid-20s, right? All of my early 20s, I started powerlifting. And by the time I was, I think, 23, I was already squatting like 475 originally. So I have really good bone density. Well, the same thing, you start talking about your spine and everything else. If you don't want your spine to get smaller from bone degeneration over time, you need better bone density in your spine. You don't want to break bones as easy doing everyday things, or when accidents happen, having more bone density from resistance training is a good thing, and that's accomplished, with big, heavy structural movements. In other words, exercises that can press down on you. Because just like your muscle tissue, your bones get little microfractures in them, and those microfractures, your body repairs them by adding more calcium, magnesium, other stuff in there and creating greater mineral density. Well, the more bone density you have, because your bones are like a spongy material, right? It's all porous and everything. So the more bone density that it has, the harder it is to break your bones. And that includes as we get older. So that's a good thing. So you really want your bones and your joints, if you want to be healthy and athletic and all of that stuff, particularly, down the road, that's going to be real helpful to you. In other words, if you've built really mobile and strong and healthy joints through full range of motion resistance training, and you've created great bone density because you've done, heavy structural exercises, load bearing exercises, the big lifts, usually standing, you're going to have a lot better bone density, your legs, your hips, your back, all of that stuff. When you get older, that is going to be an enormous asset to you. And a lot of you guys who are training now in your late teens, early 20s, start thinking about the fact that one day you're going to be your parents' age. One day you're going to be your grandparents' age. Right? You are one day. Do you want to be healthy and fit, or do you want to be all beaten up and beat and busted up? Right? I mean, all you guys say all this stuff like, man, I want all this stuff for the future. I'm training and I want this and I want that. Well, think about that in terms of what is your training and lifestyle now? What's it going to do to you down the road? Right? What's it going to do to you down the road? Because how many people do you personally know in their 40s who are still strong? And people forget that when they come over to my channel and stuff and they say, oh, I don't think you're that strong, or you're benching 332 every day. Oh, that's nothing. Or you're squatting whatever. You squat 485, you deadlift 575 on camera, blah, blah, blah. We've watched you do all that this year, but that's not that great. Well, how many guys do you know personally who train, who are in their 40s, who do those things and who walk around without too many major injuries? I'm not in my 20s, guys. I'm in my 40s. And I'm still able to do those things. Now, a lot of you guys think about that. How nice will it be to be able to do that when you get older? To actually be strong and have good bone density and not have to worry about breaking bones and not having your joints hurt all the time and all these hip problems that, maybe your dad already has, grandma has, all that stuff. Wouldn't it be nice to avoid that? So yeah, you do want to train your joints and your bones. You don't want to just train your muscles. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.